Mother-in-laws have a bad rap. They really do. It's sometimes deserved because we know from studies about marriage and conflict in marriage that at least in American culture, the number one cause of marital disharmony is money. Number two cause are in-laws. And among in-laws, mother-in-laws end up at the top of that pyramid. But we're going to see a story today, and you've been reading along as we come to chapter 9. It's hard to believe that we are now officially moving past 25%. So I'm into the percentages that you are coming through the scripture. And this week you're going to read the book of Ruth is what you're going to be looking at as you pick up your scripture and the storybook that we have and read through that. But you're going to find an unusual mother-in-law who does all good mother-in-laws proud because she is a person who really has the best interest of her daughter-in-law in mind. And that really is where this story picks up. It picks up with an interaction between three women, Naomi and her two daughters-in-law. And we find out that this story is set in the same time period that we were in last Sunday, which is the story of the period of the judges, of Samson, of Gideon, of Deborah, of Ehud, all of those. This is in the same time period. And what we discover, and you're going to discover this week as you read, is that a famine was happening in the area of Bethlehem where Elimelech and Ruth lived. And so they made a decision to move to where there was food, like people do today. They were refugees, in a sense, moving from where there was no food and where there was famine to where they could provide food. Unfortunately, the place they were moving into was occupied by the Moabites. The Moabites were one of those tribes of people that were supposed to have been eradicated whenever Israel moved into the land, but they didn't do it. And so periodically, the Moabites would be oppressing the Israelites. So here you have this interplay where you have Jews moving into enemy territory because they need food, but apparently there was some, at least, truce or peace at this time with Moab. Naomi and Elimelech moved during the time of this great compromise cycle that we looked at last week. Remember, they forgot about God, they sinned, compromised themselves with the people around them. God punishes them, they cry out for help, God forgives them, God raises up a judge, delivers them, they forget, go back into the cycle again. So that's the background for the story today. We know that when they moved into this area, they moved into an area that they were forbidden to marry into this group. And yet, Naomi's two sons do exactly that. They marry Moabite women, and Ruth happens to be one of them. And the other one, I always think sounds like Oprah, but it's not. But it's close to that. What happens then, as they are in this land, is that a tragedy of unimaginable proportions happens to Naomi and her family. What we understand is Elimelech dies first. Now, we don't know what happened if something came, maybe disease came through, as often happens when there's refugee movements and famine, but there was a disease. Elimelech dies. And then her two sons also die. All Naomi is left with is her daughter-in-law. She has no grandchildren through them. And Naomi, we know, whose name means beautiful, self-changes her name. She changes her name from Naomi, beautiful, to Mara, which means bitter. And when she makes this decision to return back to Bethlehem because the famine is over there, her and her husband have left property, and so there is at least some opportunity maybe to go back and somehow sell the property, get something for it, and somehow live as a widow. And this is a time period in which it is not only a terrific hardship, it is a terrific danger to be a widow. Widows were often driven to prostitution in order to survive, and were badly, badly treated in the culture. We will see, and you will see as you read both your story and the Bible along with it, that God, through His laws, always made provisions for widows to survive in an honest way in the culture around it. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But Naomi lays the cause of her tragedy really squarely on the shoulders of God. And this is what she says. She says, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Do you ever feel like that? The Lord has afflicted me, she says. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. She blames God for what happens. And she says, don't call me beautiful, call me bitter. Life sometimes has very, very bitter portions. You lose your spouse, that's a pretty difficult time. You lose your children, that's a pretty difficult time in your life. And so Naomi knows what it is to have misfortune, and so does her daughter-in-laws, who have both lost their husbands at the same time. When the worst happens, Naomi does what many people do. Naomi realizes it's time to go home. And she decides to return to Bethlehem. You know, whenever things fall apart, that's why God created this institution of family. To have a home, to have a supportive structure to go back into. Now, we understand in our culture, as in their culture, sometimes those supportive structures don't exist. And home is not a place of refuge or a place of support. It may be, in fact, a place of greater turmoil. But in Naomi's case, she was really sort of out of solutions at that point. It was to go home and, in a sense, hope for the best. Naomi very unselfishly blesses her daughters-in-laws, and she says, you guys need to stay here. You're in your own country. You have a much better chance of finding a husband here than going back with me where you're going to be a foreigner. And she advises them for their happiness. By the way, not for hers. For a widow to travel the distance, which was probably considerable from Moab back to Bethlehem, would be very dangerous. And so again, she blasts the mother-in-law kind of view, the negative view, by doing what's best for her daughters-in-laws. We also see in this passage, as we read the book of Ruth, that Ruth and Naomi both are beneficiaries in their time of tragedy of what it means to have healthy relationships. Ruth and Naomi have a relationship that really is cemented in their tragedy. They were there, apparently Ruth is there for Naomi when Elimelech dies. And then Naomi is there for Ruth when her husband dies. It is cemented in such a way that whenever Naomi says, I'm getting ready to leave, you know, she's bored, kind of got her cart ready, or her donkey, or her feet, because it probably was more walking back, that Ruth begged, the other daughter-in-law tearfully goes away. So we don't want to put the other daughter-in-law. She does what's right for her. But Ruth says, don't tell me to go away. And of course she says these very famous words. I think it's funny, we always use these in marriage. People read these during weddings all the time. But the context is a daughter-in-law talking to her mother-in-law. And so far, in 31 years of doing weddings, I've never had a daughter-in-law come up and ask her mother-in-law to come up and say this to her. Maybe you can be the first if you're getting ready to get married. Ruth says, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. You see, she's selling out, right? She's giving everything for her mother-in-law. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if death separates you and me. That's a bond, wouldn't you say? She loves her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law has been there for her, and Ruth is going to be there for Naomi as she goes back. It really is a challenging thing for Ruth to go to Bethlehem. And you need to understand that this wasn't simply a prejudiced culture. This was Ruth really going into harm's way for the sake of this relationship. You know, when you're suffering, you need healthy relationships to go through them. That's why God gives the church as a family as well, because we need one another, and we need to have those sort of close, abiding, healthy relationships. But Ruth going back to Bethlehem is, from the outside, not a very smart decision. First of all, she would be considered to be a pagan, even though we know by what she says and by what she does, she has become a God follower. But she's a foreigner. Everybody, you know, Moabites don't look like Bethlehemites. They don't look the same, and so she could easily be picked out as not belonging to that culture. She's a widow, and widows were prey to abuse. They were victims often of physical and sexual and cultural abuse. And so she's going back to a culture that now she will be the foreigner in, but she's doing it out of love for her mother-in-law and out of commitment to the God she's come to love. God is going to bless her because of that. Well, she has this healthy, sustained relationship with Naomi. Family, the shared experience. And what you see about these women, and this cannot be understated, is that both of them, throughout this story, are looking out for each other. We're going to see that when Ruth follows Naomi's instructions. We're going to see it back when Naomi says, go back to your people. And isn't that what love is supposed to do? Love is supposed to do what's best for the other person, not what's best for you, even though doing what's best for the other person might put you in harm's way. Naomi and Ruth go back to Bethlehem. They make it back there. And I said before that God had made a provision in His Word. We see this back in the 5 books of the early part of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that God provided a workfare system under the Old Testament. I happen to think God is brilliant. Do you? Do you think God is brilliant? And God knew what He was doing when He did that. The provision that God made was a provision for self-dignity. Here was the provision. The edges of the field, remember these folks are all farmers back in this period of time. When you were harvesting the field, you could not go into the edges. You know, today we do clean-cut farming. You know, the machine goes in, and when the machine is out of the field, there's nothing left. They cut the stubble even down so low now that there's no cover for wildlife and those things. But there's no food left. You don't want to leave any little grain dropped in the field. Not so the way God intended it to be. God says, don't go into the edges of the field. If you pick up a bag of grain and it spills, you can't pick it up. You can't shovel it back into the seed bag or whatever. And the reason for that is so that those who are out of work, who are poor, who are destitute, have a way to survive. And what they can do is go into the field. They don't have to ask anybody. They go into the field, and anything that's left, they can take. And so, if you picked up the Festival of Praise brochure this morning, and you look at the front of that, there is a picture of the gleaners. That, by the way, the reason why it's on there every year is because that is one of my all-time favorites. If you're looking for a gift for me, you can go to the Louvre, and you can pack it up and send it to me for Christmas, okay? Even a reproduction of the Louvre would be okay. But anyway, a wonderful, why do I love that picture so much? Because it shows the harvest in progress. Well, Ruth, in order to survive for herself and her mother-in-law, goes into the field to glean. And she is gleaning the leftovers. That's the workfare system. It is a tremendous risk to Ruth to go there. She is single. She is alone. She is a Moabitess. And she's from a group of people who are prejudiced against. She's hated. But as she is there, what happens is that Boaz, who is the owner of the field, Boaz is watching what happens. And what does Boaz see? Boaz sees this young widow in the field all day long, in the heat of the day, with keeping up with her gleaners. So as they drop, she picks it up. And the story is great from here. I tell my wife all week how I love this story. What Ruth didn't know at that point was Naomi, remember her name, she changed her name to Mara. So she's like, don't call me Naomi, don't call me beautiful, call me Mara, call me bitter. So as bitter is going around the community, instead of being bitter, what's she doing? She's telling about her misfortune, but in the story of her misfortune, Ruth is the main character. And Naomi is telling everybody, you got to meet my daughter-in-law, Ruth. Now there's a mother-in-law for you, right? That brags on her daughter, what a great person her daughter-in-law is. And Boaz has heard that story. So Boaz looks at Ruth, sees her walking in the field doing this, and Boaz is struck by her industry, her desire to supply her mother-in-law and her with food. And she becomes the object of Boaz's kindness. What does Boaz do? Boaz gives instructions to his gleaners, you saw it in the little clip we saw, to deliberately drop grain. And tells them when they stop, they need to let her share in the water and the food that they have. And so he basically tells them, if she happens to get in the way of the crop, don't say anything to her. Just let her go. And so Ruth doesn't understand Boaz's kindness. And by the way, Boaz at this point isn't really sure of why he's doing it, but he is. And Boaz, we know that he blesses Ruth. This is what he says. He says, may you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel. Listen to what he says about her faith. Under whose wings you have come to take refuge. I love that. Those words he said to her. Ruth went out that morning and she chose a field. We always talk about the lower story and the upper story. In God's upper story, God knew the field she was going to choose, but Ruth didn't understand the impact of the field she was going to choose. She could have gone to anybody's field, but she ends up, not accidentally, I don't believe, in Boaz's field. And because of that very simple decision to choose a field, do you believe that simple choices have profound impacts on life? I think you see that all throughout the Scripture, that one turn at a particular moment in one person in your life can make differences that are so monumental you can't even express them or understand them. Well, there is this twist of faith. When people talk about a twist of fate often, but here is the twist of faith. Ruth doesn't know, and Boaz apparently isn't all aware at that point. Well, in fact, if he was aware, it didn't matter. That Boaz could, and the operative word is could be the guardian redeemer. Now, here is the guardian redeemer in a nutshell. God had made a provision for those who were widowed to not have their family line cease. Because God wanted this people that were representative of His relationship with Him. And so God made this system whereby if someone was widowed and didn't have children, a relative of the deceased husband would become the husband of that deceased widow and would have at least one child with her. Now, I'm not endorsing this, I'm just explaining it, okay? That child would not be the second husband's child. He would actually be the child of the dead husband, the first husband's child. And as a result of that, that child would inherit all of his deceased father's property. Now, why did God do that? I think if you look back to understand, God did it because He didn't want to see the rich oppress the poor, and those with children, in a sense, oppress the childless. And so you have this system, and Ruth and Naomi, well, Naomi becomes aware of the system. I don't think Ruth understood at that point. And Boaz was, there's a lineage, and Boaz was second in line. He was not supposed to be the guardian redeemer. He was number 2. Now here's the way the system worked. And again, let's look at God and His brilliance of the way He gives the law. God in his infinite wisdom realized that there could be aspects of this that would not be healthy. And so here's the way God set it up. God set it up so that in order to take the widow and have children through her, you had to redeem the property. That is, the dead husband's property. You had to buy that property, and you were buying property that would never be yours. It would be your offspring, stepchild in a sense, that's who the property would belong to. So there is sort of a disincentive, right, to do this. Well, Ruth and Naomi are talk about this, and Mama, I say she's really mother-in-law, but Mama, she becomes Ruth's mother. Mama has a plan. And Mama's plan is that Ruth has to ask Boaz to redeem the family. And as he redeems the family, he's not only redeeming their land, he's not only taking Ruth to be his wife, but he's taking Naomi too to be mother-in-law. He gets the whole package, right? It's a big deal. So here's the instructions that are given. There is one little inaccuracy in the little video we saw this morning. Boaz is not in his bedroom. Boaz has been threshing out grain, and he's laying in the pile of grain. So Boaz apparently has been threshing out grain, and I guess when they were done, they had a celebration, and Boaz had some wine to drink, and he's sleeping. Now the rest of the story is accurate, and that is that Ruth dresses herself in her best dress. She bathes first, bathes herself, dresses herself, puts on Chanel No. 5, or whatever the perfume of the day would be, and she goes and she lays at the feet of Boaz. Now think about it, okay? She lays at his feet, and somewhere during the night he wakes up. There is nothing, there's not those other undertones that you might be thinking in your mind. So get those out of your mind. They're not there in this procedure here. But he realizes there's somebody there, and then Ruth pops the question to Boaz. Here's what she says. Again, great. This is another one of those quotes from the scripture. I think that is if you're a romantic person, this is a romantic quote. Here it is. Spread the corner of your garment. It should say over me there. I think I missed over me, since you are the guardian redeemer of my family. That's the action by him taking his blanket and letting the bottom part, she's still at his feet, covering her. It's him agreeing to take on everything that comes along with it. Boaz says yes, he really says yes, but I want to do it, however, there's somebody who's number one in line, and so I can't do it unless they say no. And Boaz, here's what we come to understand about Boaz. He's older than Ruth. I don't think Boaz is a particularly handsome guy, because what he says to Ruth is, he praises her and he says, you could have chosen a younger person, somebody that's wealthier, but you chose me. Now, I think there's more to that. We'll see that in just a moment. But Boaz brings Ruth out before the elders of the communities. We function here. We have an African council. We have elders on that council. We come together and make decisions. So this is probably more familiar in African culture than American culture. But the elders are going to decide. So the elders come together, and the first guy in line says, oh yeah, I'd like to have the property. And then Boaz says, well, on the day you take the property, you get Ruth and you get Mara over here too. And the guy said, whoa, wait a second. I just wanted the land. I didn't want a wife and, imagine that, you get a wife and a mother-in-law? He says no. He declines, and Boaz and Ruth marry. It is a great story of redemption for the terrible tragedy that both Naomi and Ruth suffered from. And I think the height of the redemptive part of the story is really found in a sentence that you might not see as being redemptive, but I want you to see it here. Naomi is restored through her grandson, Obed. Listen to what it says. And if you're a grandparent, only a grandparent can understand this. If you don't have grandkids, those of us who don't, probably can't get this, but if you're a grandparent, you'll understand. Then Naomi, that's grandma, right? Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, Naomi has a son. Did you ever meet a grandparent like that? They're like, that might be your baby, but that's my baby, right? So no, it's not Mara has a son, because her bitterness has been transformed. Naomi has a son, even though it was her grandchild. That's the photograph. You have Ruth and Boaz having little Obed, and little Obed, right? Ruth and Boaz are standing there in the maternity ward, and grandma, mother-in-law, is the one that's got the baby. And the women are saying, Naomi has a son. That's redemption. That's her grandson. Listen to the twist in the redemption of this story here. All the tragedy that happens there, even the disobedience of these two boys, Naomi's sons, marry pagan women. Those two boys marry pagan women, but Obed, the son of Ruth and Boaz, will become the grandfather of King David. But know something else about this unexpected lineage of the king. And this is something, I have to be honest with you, I didn't catch this until this. I've read the Bible through a couple of times, and this is the first time I caught this. Ruth was a Moabitess, right? She came to faith in the one true God. But guess who was Boaz's mom? Rahab. Rahab from Jericho. Boaz's mom was a pagan who became a God-fearer. So what I see in this that struck me coming through about the way God redeems the world is, we always talk about purity of blood, the purity of the line, so to speak. And when we look at Jesus' lineage, which the Bible, in a fascinating way, in Luke and in Matthew, wants to put the lineage of Jesus before us, but we zip through that lineage and we fail to realize who's in the lineage. And here you have Boaz, who at most is half Jewish, right? Boaz is only half Jewish. And Ruth, who is a Moabite, marries who is all pagan, right? She's 100% Moabitess. Marries somebody who is half Jewish. So does that make Obed like 1/4 Jewish? I don't know how you put all the percentages together, but here's what I can tell you. He was not a pure-blooded Jew, was he? What does that tell us about the way God wants to redeem people? That God is always reaching out for those who respond to Him. And you'll remember this scene. This story takes place in the days of the judges, and what we're told about the Israelites is everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. And here you have the pagans, who the Jewish people were supposed to be the light to the world to them. Here you have the pagans responding to God. And the Jewish people rebelling against God. And what does God do? God says, I use the people who respond to me. What a great story. What's the lower story here? Well, the lower story is that life's tragedies seem endlessly overwhelming to us. When you start this story in the book of Ruth, it's a terrible story. It's a sad, sad story. It's normal for people to blame God for the bad things that happen to them. That's why my title is what it is today. At the very front page, you might have noticed it said, when bad, and I have it struck out. There's a book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, but here you have when good things happen to bad people. Ruth the Moabitess. Boaz, the son of a prostitute. Life can be bitter. We need support of healthy relationships to deal with hardships. The risks to redeem tragedy are high. Ruth risked a lot when she left. And the redemption of our tragedies comes through our connection with other people. That's what we see through here. The upper story is that God has a plan that can never be thwarted by the most terrible of human tragedies. And that is what this story tells us. God redeems the story somehow. He always redeems the story. God is not the source of the tragedy, even though He took the blame for it, but He is the redeemer of the tragedy. Bitterness submitted to a divine opportunity will result in redeeming blessings. There is Naomi, who had a right to be bitter, who also allows her life to be blessed. And the Old Testament is not a story about God's chosen people, but it's about those who choose to follow God. And so you see, Judges is a book about people just messing up. And then Ruth, which takes place in the same time period, is about somebody who doesn't mess up, who really understands that a person can't follow God. God will use the faithful even though they're flawed. There's a Moabitess, there's Boaz, the son of a prostitute, who are used by God. And finally, your sordid past does not dictate your blessed future, nor does a bitter past. This is a great story this week. I hope you enjoyed as much as I have enjoyed looking at it, and that God speaks to you in your own life about how He wants to bless you.